Hello and a warm welcome from the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs. Welcome from all of us. I'm Kirsten Fontenrose, Director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. We're delighted you can join us today for this discussion. We're here today to talk about the findings in a new report published by the Atlantic Council and written by investigative researcher Tim McKetty. The report is a comprehensive fieldwork-based analysis of the material procurement network of militants operating in Bahrain. While I'll leave the findings to Tim to discuss, there is a useful framing for the paper that sets us up well for this discussion. First, the case study details the scale and scope of Iranian materiel in Bahrain. It also serves as a guide to identify Iranian materiel and patterns of Iran's activities across the region. And lastly, it has lessons for how to go about identifying and exposing illicit arms trade in the Middle East and elsewhere writ large. It is with this in mind that we've designed our panel today. Using lessons from this case study, how can we better prevent or disrupt international illicit weapons flows and strengthen arms embargoes? What are the tools we have at our disposal that we could be using more effectively? And what tools do we not have yet, but that we should have and should develop? Answering these questions and a host of others from our legendary moderator and from you are our speakers today, and allow me to introduce them to you. Starting for us is Tim McKetty, the author of the report we are launching today and an investigative researcher on illicit weapons transfers. Tim spent several years documenting the flow of illicit weapons across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, establishing and running field operations in Bahrain, Israel, Lebanon, Libya, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and Yemen, and supporting similar field operations in Algeria, in Egypt, in several other countries doing similar work. Tim is currently working with a range of clients on strategic engagement and resource mobilization, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Global Fund, and he operates a private advisory firm focused on arms control and supply chain security. Commenting on Tim's paper and offering her own insights and expertise is Rachel Stoll, an expert on global security and conventional arms trade. She's a vice president at the Stimson Center and director of the center's conventional defense program. Previously, Rachel held fellow and senior analyst roles at Chatham House and the Center for Defense Information, and was a consultant to organizations including the United Nations, Oxfam, Project Plowshares, SIPRI, the Small Arms Survey, and World Vision. Rachel is also shaping the next generation to think about these issues as an adjunct professor at the Security Studies program at Georgetown University. We're also joined by David Mortlock. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. David is also a partner at the law firm Wilkie Farr and Gallagher, where he focuses on sanctions, export controls, and other international trade issues. Previously, David was a director for international economic affairs at the White House's National Security Council, and he held roles at the US Department of State, including Deputy Coordinator for Sanctions Policy and Attorney Advisor for Sanctions and Terror Finance. David was centrally involved in the development of the US sanctions programs for Russia and Iran, including restrictions on those countries' energy sectors. We're also joined from Nairobi by Jay Bahadur, Jumbo Jay. He's an investigative researcher, former coordinator of a UN panel of experts on Somalia, and author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Pirates of Somalia. Jay has written articles for international news outlets like the New York Times, the Financial Times, all the Times, and he has advised US government on Somali piracy policy. Previously, he was managing editor of Somalia Report, an independent news service employing over 100 Somali journalists in Somalia and Kenya. And as I mentioned, Jay is currently joining us from Nairobi, so just a slight little time difference there, Jay. Thanks for being here. Lastly, I'm delighted to introduce Norm Rule, our moderator for today's conversation. Norm is the American legend most Americans have never heard about, having spent 34 years at the CIA and holding the position of National Intelligence Manager for Iran at the Office of the Director for National Intelligence for nearly a decade. Norm brings a wealth of his own experience to the challenge we will discuss today, and I expect he will urge our panelists to really dig into the problem, identify why it hasn't yet been solved, and present their expert ideas for what might be viable new options for improving mitigation methods against illicit conventional weapons flows. Before I turn the program over to Norm, I want to remind everyone to submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the event, as we've reserved time after the moderated discussion for your questions. If you're watching via our live stream on YouTube or Twitter, you're welcome to tweet your questions to us using the hashtag AC Mid East. Lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't point you toward the excellent written work that our panelists have published on this topic, including the report that is at the center of today's event. You will find in the chat momentarily Tim's report, as well as additional reports by Rachel and David. So Norm, I place all of us in your trusted hands.
Good morning, Kirsten, and thank you very much for that generous opening. I would also like to thank the Atlantic Council for allowing me to participate in what is a stellar group of expertise on this issue. If a National Security Council session were being held today, it would be exactly these people that I would bring in front of the group of policymakers and warfighters to address what has been an issue that has bedeviled administrations for several decades in particular, but 2 decades associated with Iran itself since the US war with Iraq. Going forward in coming months, the Biden administration has got a number of priorities, one of which is regional cooperation in the Middle East, ending forever, another would be ending forever wars, and finally another would be promoting interaction among regional governments to improve international economies after the pandemic. Illicit weapons transfer stands in the way of all of this. On Iran alone, Iran has provided weapons to Syria, which has provoked a version of a forever war with Israeli airstrikes. It has provided precision-guided missiles and drones to Yemen, as well as small arms, which has provoked a missile war, perhaps the most significant missile war since the Second World War between Saudi Arabia missile defenses and Yemen. And of course, we have the small arms, the explosives that have been routinely sent by Iran against Bahrain, have been provided to militias in Iraq, have been provided to terrorists in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. Not to focus all of this on Iran, we have the issue of East Africa, which has been suffering because of the Yemen conflict and because of weaponry that has extruded from that conflict, and the militias in Africa in general, which have benefited from the illicit arms trade and destabilized so many countries in that area. It will be impossible, in my view, for the Biden administration to achieve any signal success in regional cooperation unless a new approach is taken to staunch this flow of weapons, which so many countries in the region view as a threat. You will have proposals periodically that we should have architecture such as the OSCE reconstituted in a Middle East version. I would point out that when the OSCE was formulated, it was done so many years after Russia was conducting open attacks against Western states. You have a situation today where the Quds Force is conducting open attacks against multiple states. Nonetheless, this will be a significant challenge, and the Biden administration, based on my understanding of their internal deliberations, is very focused on achieving progress in this area. So, without wasting any more time on my opening statement, I'd like to turn this to Tim McKetty for his superb explanation of the superb Bahrain file report, which I encourage everyone to read. Tim, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Norman. And thank you to the Atlantic Council and my fellow panelists for joining in on this discussion. It's a topic I'm personally very fascinated in, and always like sharing, the work that I have done over the years, and also to learn about other people's perspectives and how we could address this issue. So just to kind of provide a quick background on the report and its development and how it culminated. This all kind of started back in 2015 when I was reading news about the war in Yemen and how there was a lot of allegations about Iranian support to the Houthis. However, you never were able to find or were presented with verifiable evidence. And at that time, I was working for an organization called Conflict Armament Research, which specializes in the investigation of the illicit transfers of weapons and identifying transfer vectors and tracing material back through its supply chain. So
Tim, you appear to have frozen
sources of illicit weapons circulating in the region, where they were, their provenance, and in doing so, being able to identify if there were any outside sources attributable to Iran. So from that project in Yemen, it eventually spread to other countries within the Arabian Peninsula, namely Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, with also work happening with some colleagues in the Levant, some of the work I was doing in Israel, as well as in the Horn of Africa. In late 2019, I independently engaged the Kingdom of Bahrain to do an assessment of all of the weapons material that they had seized in their country to date. And that kind of served as the kernel for the Bahrain file report. So what this project did was not just to look at the physical material, but it also broadened the scope to look at electronic evidence, biometrics, like DNA and latent fingerprints lifted off material, as well as suspect testimonial and other corroborating pieces of evidence. The purpose was to be able to quantify specifically how much material was attributable to Iran and what was perhaps attributable to other regional sources of proliferation or being manufactured domestically, specifically with radio-controlled improvised explosive devices. So using that work, bringing some of my previous research when I was with conflict armament research, as well as bringing in other unique cases that were generated by the UN panels of experts and other independent researchers. One key case was the Jihan 1, which was a Dow that was interdicted in January 2013 and was determined by the UN after investigation to have originated in Iran. The material on that Dow served as a very important point of evidence that connected a lot of the material in Bahrain as well as material in these other countries that we were investigating. So as Kirsten mentioned, the point was not only just to quantify the scope and scale of material attributable to Iran, but also to develop something that I personally would have really enjoyed having when I first started out. And that was a guide to best understand material that is attributable and material that is not. Because often analysts are quite prone to hysteria when saying that Iran is supporting XYZ groups without providing the evidence. And also I'm hoping that this could then inform evidence-based analysis. So in Bahrain specifically, the reason why the scope of the report focused from 2013 to 2018 is because that's the time frame in which material seizures were most prolific. And the last actual seizure of material in Bahrain occurred in February 2018 that can be linked directly to Iran. There were also 4 primary instances of interdictions that can be linked to Iran. One was a bus case in 2015 coming over the border from Saudi Arabia. 2 were maritime interdictions in 2013 and 2015. And the most recent and last one was in December 2016 of a small skiff coming over from Iran based on its GPS data that had landed in the Nabi Saleh region of Manama. Why this shifted over time, it's, that's left up to speculation. Perhaps, Iran shifted its focus to Yemen, or the interdiction and exploitation investments and improvements that Bahrain made got to a level where they can, catch all this material. So getting to the report itself, the approach that I took was to really look at the full range of material that was being seized and then set specific criteria. Some of these criteria include the mode of entry into Bahrain, whether they came by maritime route or land route, the treatment of the material, such as the removal of identifiable information, such as serial numbers or factory markings, what the material was commingled with at the time. So you'll often see, and actually most of the time, any material that is attributable to Iran was solely commingled with other material linked to that network. Then also very significantly is its correlation and correspondence with material from the Jihan 1, as well as other regional, material documented in the regions seized from groups that have linkages to Iran itself. We also did some chemical analysis of the C4 to determine its significance. And then also with radio-controlled IEDs, the material that they're made out of and types of construction. So what does it show? It shows quite clearly, in my estimation, that a majority of the material recovered in Bahrain actually is attributable to transfers from Iran. Specifically with assault rifles, half the rifles recovered in Bahrain in the time period are attributable to Iran. 3/4 of the ammunition and a significant majority of the radio-controlled IEDs. In doing this work, it's actually quite useful because you're able to identify the connections purely based on patterns between material documented in different regions. So with radio-controlled IEDs, for example, and they will have certain components or construction characteristics. A material that has originated in Iran, it quite frequently shows up with certain heat wire wrapping on the outside of its components, as well as with certain PIR sensors and so on and so forth. Doing this work regionally is actually quite important because it provides you that broader lens to actually understand the findings within context. So the original aha moment in finding out that IEDs in Bahrain were linked to the Houthis and therefore to Iran was in taking apart and actually physically exploiting these items and in coming to the realization that they are not just similar, but actually identical in the components they're used, how they're put together across these spaces. So, I mean, I could go on and on forever about this, but I want to keep my time limited, but I'd be happy to delve more into it in the Q&A.
Thank you, Tim. I heard a couple of interesting points there. I heard first that there is a great utility in comparing shipments among various countries, and therefore an enormous importance in sharing that reporting and that detail among regional countries who are under threat. This would seem to be something that GCC could take on with greater emphasis, and sharing this with the European Union, which has not been the most robust in the eyes of the GCC, certainly, in taking on Iran's regional malign activity. The introduction of IEDs and explosives to Bahrain is also, I should point out, a threat to Saudi Arabia. The Bahraini government believes that a large portion of this material is not necessarily meant for Bahrain, but is meant to be taken across the causeway. So thank you for that really important overview, and I encourage everyone to read your report. And we'll have questions at the end of this. I'd like to move now, if I may, to Jay Bahadur, who's going to speak about the Al Bahri 2 Dow investigation. Jay, over to you.
Thank you, Norm, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting me here tonight, and to Tim for his excellent work. I'm going to speak very briefly about a case I reported on for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime that was published last November. This was the case of the seizure of the Dow Al Bahri 2 that was interdicted by Saudi naval forces on the 24th of June of last year, while transporting arms from the Persian Gulf to the rebel Houthi administration in Yemen. And this was the 10th such Dow seizure by naval forces since late 2015. The illicit consignment seized consisted of almost 1,300 Type 56-1 Chinese-made assault rifles, as well as anti-tank guided missiles and other weaponry that was believed to have been manufactured in Iran. As Tim notes in his paper, Type 56-1s have been widely documented in Bahrain, and they've also ended up in Somalia. And actually, for a project I'm working on currently, we just documented one on the Puntland Ethiopia border, which raises concerns that the spillover and conflict from the Yemen war might actually go towards further destabilizing Ethiopia in its time of internal strife. One big takeaway was that the arms trafficking network responsible for operating the Al Bahri 2 was based in Somalia, with footprints in Iran, Yemen, and the UAE. And this was the first known case of a Somali trafficking network involved in the transfer of arms from Iran to the Houthis. The head of the network is a Somali national named Mohammed Omar Salim, who is based in both Bosaso and Mogadishu. At the time, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo attempted to use the al-Bahrain 2 seizure to garner support for U.S. efforts to so-called snapback UN sanctions on Iran. Washington maintained at the time that the terms of the JCPOA, or so-called Iran deal, allowed it to unilaterally snap back UN sanctions, despite having withdrawn from the deal. This U.S. position was rejected, and the snapback attempt at the UN actually cost the U.S. Quite a lot of political capital at the UN, and further created issues with the European allies that were also part of the Iran deal. The main point I'd like to make, based on this case study, and again I can post in the chat a link to the full paper, but is that UN arms embargoes, these UN arms embargoes both on Iran and on Yemen have been routinely flouted, and they're most effective at curtailing direct state-to-state supply of arms. It is unlikely, in my opinion, that a continued UN arms embargo on Iran would have been effective at deterring sophisticated transnational criminal networks, such as the one responsible for the al-Bahrain 2 arms shipment. The Biden administration has signaled its intention to rejoin the JCPOA should Iran abide by its obligations thereunder, which is currently in breach of course. With presidential elections in Iran slated for June, one possible gesture of goodwill might be a public recognition that the UN arms restrictions on Iran have expired, as the rest of the Security Council has supported. And this could potentially provide domestic fodder for Iranian moderates to help salvage the political track. And one thought is that a greater support in Iran for a political solution, which has really deteriorated in the past years, may reduce the impetus for the state to arm its regional proxies, including the Houthis. I'll make one last point before passing on. Historically, disrupting commercial trafficking in small arms and light weapons has been sort of a secondary priority to counterterrorism, and certainly as far as my experience in Somalia goes. However, this approach discounts evidence that such commercial networks often overlap with terrorist groups. And for instance, the Mohammed Omar Salim network has direct ties to an AQAP and IS facilitator in Yemen named Saif Badani, who also has links to the Houthis. And commercial arms traffickers in Puntland routinely import weapons that go to al-Shabaab and the Islamic State factions in Somalia. I found through personal experience that the actors involved in commercial arms smuggling in Somalia are easily identifiable and also have some sort of imprint in the global financial system in some way, be it trading in UAE and so on. And they're also not significant in numbers. They don't go a long way to hide themselves. And it's long been my belief, and I pushed for it when I was on the UN panel, is that targeted sanctions against arms smugglers, key bad actors in these networks, may in fact have some positive effect at deterring arms smuggling. But I'm sure there are others with more experience on the sanctions tools that can comment on that. So that's all for me, and I thank you very much again, and I'll be open for questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay. So I heard a number of really interesting themes there. First, as with Tim, we've seen evidence of small arms being shipped into these countries. It's not always ballistic missiles or armed drones. We're talking about the types of weapons that sustain low-level conflicts. And this is in part done because a number of the actors in these conflicts just don't take care of their weaponry very well, and often providing new and clean weaponry is something that can boost both their capability and Iranian influence. I also heard information on the spillover into other conflicts in Africa that should be considered by policymakers on each side as to the consequences of not stopping this. As to the embargo being flouted, I think the question is, and I might have a different view from you, Jay, but I think the question really becomes on Iran: is it capable of having a regional foreign policy independent of the Quds force? Hitherto, the answer has been a firm no. And the Iranian president and the foreign minister have no influence over these issues. If Iran changes that, that would indeed be a signal that it's ready to turn over a new leaf, open a new chapter in its regional relations. I'm not sanguine that would happen, but Jay's point is an important one. And finally, we've seen evidence once again that if you're able to collate this information and share it with various players, you're able to to work against these networks. If the GCC or the EU is able to use this information, not in intelligence channels, but in sort of an open cooperative way, you have an opportunity to impact the financial lifeblood of these smugglers. One footnote, I have often found that smugglers who are involved in weapons activity in Africa are also involved in wildlife trafficking, blood diamonds, and narco trafficking. So really, there's a lot of benefit to working on this. Thank you very much, Jay. That was quite useful. And now if we may turn to Rachel Stoll, and Rachel's going to discuss the international mechanisms that exist and might be employed against this problem set. Rachel, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Norman, and thanks to the Atlantic Council. It's an honor to speak on these issues alongside such talented experts. I'm certainly learning a lot and eager to enter into a conversation. As you said, I am going to focus on the international mechanisms and international regulatory architecture that can regulate the trade in conventional weapons in not only in the Middle East and the Horn of Africa, but globally. And then conclude with some recommendations of ways to prevent and combat illicit trafficking in the region. Now, there are several existing conventional arms control mechanisms that can be applied to prevent and combat illicit weapon flows. The majority of them focus on that very thing, on the illicit trade, but we can also look at how to control the legitimate trade in weapons to prevent their diversion into the illicit market. So these existing agreements include legally binding treaties like the Arms Trade Treaty or the Firearms Protocol, as well as some voluntary frameworks like the UN Program of Action on Illicit Small Arms and Light Weapons, or the UNPOA, and the UN Register of Conventional Arms, or UN ROCA. Now, there are several important differences between these four mechanisms, but a central point of synergy is their commitment to increasing transparency and responsibility in the global arms trade in order to prevent and combat illicit arms transfers. So these four mechanisms hold great potential for mitigating illicit weapons flows in the region, but they're only meaningful if they are actually implemented. So I want to do like a lightning round of explanation of what each of these are for the audience that isn't familiar with them. So the Arms Trade Treaty requires states to develop national systems that control and under certain circumstances actually prohibit the cross-border transfer of conventional weapons. Now this is all conventional weapons, from the small arms and light weapons that Tim and Jay have mentioned, all the way through conventional warships and aircraft. The premise is that stronger controls on the legal and the legitimate trade make it easier to combat the illicit trade. So there's an entire article in the ATT that encourages states to ensure national measures mitigate and prevent diversion. A core tenet of the ATT is transparency, that if states are required to annually report on their legal arms exports and imports, which we can then better monitor what's supposed to be moving from location to location and identify when there are items outside of that legal trade. States also have to report on measures that they take to implement the ATT and the national measures that they have in their control systems that demonstrate how they are enforcing and regulating the legal trade and how therefore they can track the illicit trade. Combating illicit trafficking is, of course, a core tenet of the Firearms Protocol, which directs states parties to take appropriate measures to detect, prevent, and eliminate the theft, loss, or diversion of firearms, their parts and components, and ammunition. So now these two agreements are the only two legally binding global treaties that address conventional arms transfers, which is often quite surprising to people when they think about the myriad of other international treaties that exist to control other kinds of weapon systems. Regional participation in the Middle East and Horn of Africa are really lacking in these treaties. Only 14% of states in the region are parties to the ATT. Only 38% have ratified the Firearms Protocol. So these are not mechanisms that are utilized by the region to great extent. There are also voluntary agreements, as I mentioned, that contain mechanisms that help states mitigate illicit trafficking and diversion. The UNPOA contains guidance on numerous measures that states can take to control and strengthen their national systems, ranging from control of brokers and the those along the supply chain, as well as greater stockpile management, security procedures, and marking and tracing. There's a whole range of issues there. The UN Register is a global transparency regime that again requires states, much like the ATT, to report on their national exports and imports on an annual basis. It's similar, but it's open to all states. You don't have to be a party. It's a voluntary mechanism. Although many Middle East and Horn of African countries have participated in these regimes a couple of times, their regular and consistent reporting and participation is really lacking. And so again, not having the tools at their disposal can hamper prevention of illicit trafficking. Finally, I'd like to briefly touch on 3 things that can be done in the region using these instruments to more effectively mitigate illicit weapons flows. First and foremost, we really need to work to promote widespread participation in, but also implementation of these existing arms control arrangements. I recognize that political will is essential, but we need to work with states in the region to generate buy-in to these agreements. They need to understand why participation is a net win. It is not a prohibition on their activities, and that being a participant will actually support their legitimate trade and allow them to combat illicit transfers. And I should also say that we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach, not only for the region, but states within that region. And so we have to continue to emphasize a state-led approach to addressing conventional weapons, wherein states ultimately determine what implementation measures work best, what is most needed to combat the transfers that are most detrimental to them. Second, we need to ensure that any attempt to develop additional control measures for the region or the world more broadly reinforce the importance and impact of existing international treaties and multilateral regimes, and aims to not only support them, but not lower existing standards. We've often seen measures proposed that are actually lower of a standard than already exists internationally. We want to beef those instruments up, not lower them to the floor. And third, we need to think more creatively of how to involve key stakeholders as partners in prevention. We can start in many cases with legitimate industry. We have tens of thousands of actors along the global supply chain that can drive legitimate commerce that sometimes knowingly or unwittingly facilitate criminal activity. So you mentioned in your introduction to my remarks, Norman, that the transfer of arms is linked to the transfer of other illicit goods and services. And we cannot really understate that a courier, a distribution entity, a broker, a transportation company that is involved in the transfer of arms going one way, on the return trip may be transferring other illicit goods if it makes economic sense. So if we can harmonize laws and enforcement and create market incentives for companies that are even more progressive in their efforts to prevent illicit trafficking, governments can identify and utilize choke points to prevent illicit trafficking along the way. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer additional questions. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rachel. That was really exceptional. I think what I've heard in your presentation is an important bit of perhaps advice for the Biden administration on a way forward where it can work with the United Nations and work with its regional partners to develop such adherence, implementation, and execution of existing protocols in a way that actually benefits multiple issues. I confess I'm not sure that the Quds Force in Iran has any intention of implementing or adhering to any of this, but simply asking China, how is it that so many of its weaponry, so much of its weaponry is appearing in other locations, could cause it to do stricter protocols in dealing with Iran and other countries as to where things are going. There is also, of course, the issue of counterfeit weaponry that floats around the region. I've seen many examples of European AK-47s that were turned to knockoffs by the Chinese and then moved through out the region during my career. And finally, the private sector engagement. I think there's a role for NGOs and for think tanks to highlight this issue and to urge greater engagement with these key sectors of international and unofficial economies to crack down on this. And the benefits, as I say, go to wildlife smuggling, to blood diamonds, to human trafficking. So it's very important. So last and certainly not least, we'll have David Mortlock talk about issues that the United States could focus on and other tools that we might be able to deploy unilaterally against this problem. Over to you, David.
Great. Thanks very much, Norm. Really a pleasure to be here today with you and the rest of the panelists. And congratulations to Tim on the report. Really encourage everyone to give it a read. It's fascinating. Rachel discussed a number of mechanisms and tools that exist to govern the flow of arms over borders. But the one limitation that exists with most of these tools is that they rely on member states to implement them. Right? We can impose obligations under UN Security Council resolutions, but it still relies on the member states. And as you said, Norm, the question that allows us to then pressure governments to meet those obligations. But nonetheless, we're still relying on others. And so I think it raises the question of what can the United States do, either unilaterally or with key partners, to further tighten the restrictions that on the illicit flow of conventional weapons globally. And so I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to look at what the options are, what the tools are with respect to sanctions, and how we can use those tools to track and make it more difficult to transfer those weapons. I want to start by being realistic about the limitations on the tool, right? We deploy sanctions for different reasons in different cases. I don't think that anyone is going to wake up one morning and think, well, I'm going to quit my job in the illegal transfer of weapons because I might be sanctioned by the United States. I think that's probably unlikely. But what sanctions can do is make it more difficult and more expensive for these networks to operate. And we know that because we've had success in other areas. And I think the two sanctions regimes that sort of provide the blueprint for this are the terrorism sanction regime under EO 13224, which was issued in 2001 in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, and then EO 13384, which is the non-proliferation executive order issued in 2005. And basically, with these orders, in a similar way, we don't expect these sanctions to deter, in most cases, terrorism or proliferation, but these tools have made the financing of both activities much more difficult. And partly that's because of what's known as the derivative designation tool that exists in both these orders that allows Treasury to designate those providing support to anyone already on the list, right? So it's not just a matter of naming ISIS or Al-Qaeda, it's a matter of naming their supporters, their financiers, their couriers, and so on down the line, making it much more difficult for them to access the global financial system. It also means that Treasury can act on intelligence and other non-public information, because the administrative procedure of imposing these sanctions means that Treasury can use classified information to build that case, can create an administrative record under the reasonable basis standard, and impose sanctions via that mechanism. There's no such global authority for trafficking in conventional arms, though. EO 13382 is limited to 13384 is limited to material contributions to proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery. So does not touch on conventional weapons. The closest we have, though, is a sort of case study, a very recent case study for Iran, which is EO 13949, President Trump issued in September of last year, following the Security Council's declination to renew the arms embargo, which others have already discussed. The United States issued this domestic tool and essentially allows Treasury to impose sanctions on those selling or supplying arms or related materials to Iran. And as I said, build out that network of those who are doing so. We don't really know how effective this is going to be with respect to Iran for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it's very young. This was an authority that was just issued in September. It also is fairly duplicative, right? There are obviously sanctions and the threat of sanctions on those doing business with the government of Iran already. And so how the US will use this tool distinctively, how the Biden administration will use this tool distinctively is up in the air. And the other challenge is that, while usually when we threaten sanctions against persons outside the United States, as a general matter, historically, we have done so consistent with international norms, if not on the same page on sanctions, at least in line diplomatically with our partners overseas. But obviously, that was not the case in September of last year. And we issued this executive order threatening sanctions at a time when almost all the rest of the world was willing to allow the arms embargo on Iran to expire. So, is this a particularly good case study? How will the Biden administration use it to go after conventional arms networks in Iran? Is an open question. It's also, it's worth noting, this may seem a little bit tangential, but I think there is significant sensitivity around a global conventional arms sanctions program, given Second Amendment rights. And we've seen the collision of these two issues previously in July of 2014, when Treasury sanctioned Kalashnikov, the Russian arms manufacturer. There was a lot of concern expressed from Second Amendment rights groups about whether this was a backdoor attack on gun rights. And so I think this is something we could absolutely see in the debate about a global conventional arms tool. So let me stop there. Obviously delighted to answer questions, and thanks again for allowing me to join the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much, David. And I should say that I've had the good fortune of spending a number of useful government meetings with David in the room, and I've watched how policymakers from both sides of the aisle have turned to him for his wise counsel. Didn't always provide solutions they would take, but they certainly knew the options that were available to them in a crisp and cogent way. So before we turn to some questions from the audience, and again, I would encourage the audience to provide questions for the Q&A feature, I would like to ask a couple of general questions to the group on my own. And you can feel free to add other issues that you perhaps might have thought about as you've listened to other speakers. So what I've heard today are really several different themes. First, an awful lot about proof that Iran has exported conventional precision-guided weaponry that has exacerbated conflicts in a number of areas, and it draws upon an infrastructure that extends from the Levant to East Africa. That's not news. The Saudis and in the Trump administration displayed literally tons of Iranian weaponry that have been fired from Yemen. The Bahrainis have displayed material, and going back to years, the US government has even talked about at the United Nations Iranian weapons that have been captured in dhows. Not news. Secondly, we have smuggling nodes and individuals who are involved in this in Africa. But I think we also need to consider the issue of the nodes of logistics within Iran itself. And I haven't heard much about that. which ports are used, which companies are used, which trucking companies are used, which parts of the Iranian government are involved in the logistical aspect of providing this equipment, this weaponry, and these explosives to militants that have threatened so many of our partners and friends in the region. I should also note a number of these locations have, such as Bahrain, have the presence of American warfighters, and this is a direct threat against our nation's treasure, the warfighters. My final point, however, is to the group. I hear an awful lot about international tools that exist, or the Trump administration has undertaken sanctions in effort of frustration that perhaps the international community hasn't taken this as seriously as the Trump administration would like. It's no secret that the United Nations Security Council has taken no action of consequence against Iran for some years. The European Union has devoted very little of its rhetorical space to the issue of arms transfers in the region. And I encourage people to look at UN Security Council resolutions or European Union statements to confirm what I've stated. So there does appear to be an element of, is the international community capable of doing this job? We appear to have some very good instruments, some tools out there, some efforts to add to those tools, wisely or not, by the US government. But now we have an administration in Washington that seeks to undertake a greater multilateral engagement with the world. Is that a wise choice? If the world is not willing to take this seriously, I'm not against multilateralism. Indeed, I strongly support it. But there is a case to be made that will Russia take steps against Iran at the United Nations Security Council? Will China undertake steps in international fora against these arms shipments? Can the GCC acquire sympathy in these areas? And in the Yemen conflict, we now have transshipment nodes in East Africa that have been long talked about by GCC partners that appear to be proven by evidence. Is the international community willing to take action against any actor involved in arms shipments? So with this said, perhaps we'd like to do a bit of a lightning round around the room. And again, if others want to add on or speak to someone else's comments, you should feel free to go in. Tim, what do you have to say?
Well, thank you for that great overview. One thing that you did kind of summarize, the first point you mentioned in terms about that evidence has been kind of presented to the public previously. While that is true, and you have seen actually an evolution of this with Ambassador Nikki Haley when she presented the Iranian military display at the Joint Base Anacostia Bowling right outside of Washington, D.C. The one issue I took with that, while it's a great step forward from what was done previously, is that it was done within a political context. It was immediately politicized. I would have advised that you had technical experts walking people through the evidence itself, as well as providing more granular access to that information as well. You know, in my experience in working with Bahrain, I got to give them, big props for allowing this type of work to happen and go forward. Being able to have radical transparency like that, I feel advances us incrementally towards a point where you need to allow people to evaluate the evidence themselves. I also think this is something that we could then advance on as well in building a forensically accurate regional picture, and by encouraging other governments in the region to do so as well. It not only allows third parties to come in and verify the claims that they're making, whether to verify or challenge a narrative or to refine it, but then also allows, the type of information that would enable, the development or implementation of international instruments or sanctions to work more properly and function as they should.
Thank you very much. Jay, over to you. And I would ask people to recall that our time is limited. We have about another 10 minutes, so crisp comments would be appreciated. Jay, anything for the group?
Yeah, no, very quickly. Thank you for those comments and your summary. I would only add, working at the UN Security Council for 5 years, even in that time, the council became more and more polarized. Very hard for them to agree on anything. Certainly not possible for them at the moment to agree on Iran. That said, you mentioned there haven't been any measures taken in a number of years at the Security Council level. Well, that measure was Resolution 2231. that implemented the JCPOA in the UN sort of resolution structure in Iran. Now, to be perfectly frank, in my opinion, the United States really acted in sort of bad faith in withdrawing from that deal immediately. So I think it wasn't only China and Russia that sort of opposed the U.S. Stance on the Iran deal. It was, as I said, pretty much they were isolated by the entire Security Council midway through last year. So this kind of I guess, bullying approach, I don't know if it'll have much of an effect going forward. And that said, I mean, as I stated before, I mean, I don't think UN measures on Iran were effective, particularly before, except in terms of inhibiting ballistic missile production and so on. And those restrictions still remain in place to this day. But in terms of this proliferation of conventional weapons, things like drones that Iran has reverse engineered, weaponry like that, I think it's very difficult to use UN restrictions to stem those flows. So thank you.
Thank you. And you're absolutely correct. The United Nations Security Council and every one of our allies opposed, I believe, the U.S. withdrawal from JCPOA. But in fairness, almost every regional country, from Israel to the Gulf states, supported it. So you've got the question of coming up with a multilateral approach, which is what the Biden administration honorably and rightly seeks in the region in tamping down these conflicts. How do you create an architecture where you have allies and partners who are in agreement on security priorities? Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Norman. I'm an unapologetic multilateralist. So I think that, these issues cannot be addressed in a unilateral fashion. They just can't. And we've seen really a vacuum of leadership from the United States in the last 4 years, where arms sales were seen as the way in which you build security relationships and have security cooperation, rather than addressing sort of what are the root challenges and causes for those weapons to be sought. And when you sell more with less restriction, it's much easier to see those weapons move to the illicit market or used in ways that they were not intended. So I do think we've seen other countries stepping in. China has actually, you mentioned in your earlier remarks, Norman, China has actually joined the ATT while the United States was absent. Again, it's not just joining, it's implementing. It's that collective pressure to implement strict standards, to have responsible use at the forefront, to determine what is a legal, what is an illicit sale, and to enforce and harmonize approaches to address proliferation, not only in the region, but around the world. And particularly when we're looking at the Middle East and Horn of Africa, we have some bad actors, and it's not just Iran. We have countries that use weapons for illicit purposes. We have countries that are transferring weapons or that are seeing weapons transship their countries with impunity. And so there really needs to be a collective and aggressive strategy to address proliferation, not only in the region, but globally. And I believe that you must use the multilateral and international regimes that you have at your disposal as a starting point for those conversations. It can't just be one-on-one. It has to be really a collective pressure.
Full agreement. None of us are as smart as all of us. None of us are as good as all of us. And every country should be placed under the same measuring stick as another. And thank you for the reminder. China did indeed, as one of our audience members has put forward, did indeed join the AT&T. David, over to you.
So I will just note very quickly, because I think the others have it covered, but I'll just note very quickly that the fact that the United States has broad legal authority to impose sanctions unilaterally is no substitute for the benefits of a multilateral approach. And where the United States has been most effective in deploying these tools, including the terrorism and non-proliferation sanctions programs that I mentioned earlier, it's been when we've done so with the cooperation and in alignment with other governments. And so absolutely that's the case here as well.
Thank you. Well, we've only got about 5 minutes left, and we've got a few questions from audience members, which I'm going to try to compile together. And really what we've got is the issue of enforcement. As Rachel has stated, we all work best if we work together, but that's not always going to be the case. Do you foresee it's likely that we will see enforcement of these measures grow in coming months? And is there an opportunity for the Biden administration to do this? Or is this just something that they can't hope to make any progress on any more than the Obama, Bush, or Trump administration? And I'd like you to keep your responses to under a minute. David, you're still on the screen. Let's work backwards. Over to you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think, look, how the Biden administration will approach this in a new way is an open question. I note that someone else in the chat was asking about holding Russia and China accountable for their violations of the tool that Rachel has discussed. And I think look, it's the United States has the ability to talk softly and carry a big stick, right? To make clear that there is accountability for violations of what we all have agreed are international norms on weapons flow. And so I don't think a multilateral approach precludes the development of accountability mechanisms that others with a more lax approach to enforcement would rather not see.
Thank you. Rachel, our grand multilateralist, if you could speak on this, but also touch on the issue of holding financial institutions accountable in a world where everyone worries about being overly cautious and how that might impact on humanitarian issues.
Sure. I will say this. The United States is to David's point, the United States is the largest arms exporter in the world and the largest arms exporter to the region. And so it can go a long way by demonstrating some leadership in not only exercising restraint, but really working with recipient governments to both think about sort of security cooperation in the region, but also on responsible use. And to that end, it is in the defense industry's interest to see their weapons used in accordance with international humanitarian law, human rights principles, and used for legal purposes. And there are many actors, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, along that supply chain, including financial institutions that both finance those transactions, that ensure those transactions, and that work with the variety of companies along the supply chain to make sure that those are being held to the highest standards. And so there's a lot of opportunity to engage those multiple stakeholders in these discussions to ensure that we're acting in ways that is towards the common good. When the US exhibits leadership, other countries will follow. When they see it is in the US, it's not hurting the US economically to have policies that are responsible and accountable. You will see other countries follow. I have never bought into if we don't sell, China and Russia will, because I'm not holding myself to the same, I'm holding the United States to a higher standard than I'm holding China and Russia. We want to act in ways that are consistent with our national interest, with our values as a country, and with what we see the intention of those arms transfers being. And that's what I'm concerned about. That demonstration of power and leadership will create an environment where others will follow.
Thank you. And I think it's important that Congress plays its role in ensuring that any weapons sales from the United States to anywhere in the world are under the appropriate protocols so that we can confirm they're going to where they should go. And also when there are statements made that countries are illegally using those weapons in other areas, that we can either very quickly confirm or refute those. Thank you very much. Jay, I'm moving back to you quickly, sir.
Yes, I noted the comment as well in the comment section on why the focus on Iran bashing, and I'll say very quickly just to add as well to Rachel's points. I mean, we did when I was on the UN sanctions panel, we did document material that had ended up in Somalia that had come from UAE stocks, that had come from Saudi Arabian supplied weapons and United States supplied weapons to actors in Yemen. So it's not only Iran that's fueling this proxy conflict going on in Yemen. I would just very quickly echo Rachel's point that, and also David's as well, when he said we can make the process more expensive, is that the tools, sanctioning tools, can be expanded to go after the type of financing arrangements that underpin the arms trade, such as the hawala networks or semi-hawala networks that arms dealers use to transfer funds. Those tools, the AML CFT tools that have worked well with banks, can be adapted to address those particular environments that these hawala companies operate in, and that may be something as well for OFAC and State Department and the rest of the Biden administration to consider looking at.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tim, to you. And again, the Iran bashing is perhaps a function of the fact that the Bahrain report focused on Iranian weapons. Most of the weapons going to Yemen are the illicit trade is from Iran in terms of ballistic missiles and drones. But this was meant to be a sort of all-inclusive report. Tim, over to you. We're over one.
Sorry, go on, please, Norman.
We're over one, so over to you, sir.
Okay, great. Just real quick, I guess, to just kind of sum it up, as it's demonstrated, there's a lot of non-governmental entities that are doing some really interesting, innovative work in this field that are kind of pushing the knowledge forward. So in terms of recommendations for like the Biden administration or other interested governments, I just like to reiterate in terms of, opening up that space by providing access to different organizations and individuals so that we can then start to pull out information from the government realm and put it out into the public realm and balance that informational playing field so we could all be able to work more collectively as well as more on a balanced, work more collectively on these issues, as well as allowing everyone to kind of demonstrate to arms manufacturers and those who transfer weapons illicitly or otherwise, that you ultimately lose control of those, and those weapons could end up blowing back and working against your strategic objectives. So I think in doing this work, we could demonstrate there's a much more responsible way about going forward with this that would work to everyone's benefit.
Well, thank you very much. And we are over time, but I think the excess was useful. I want to thank the panelists for their extraordinary comments. This was very insightful. To the audience, I would say this is the type of expertise you would hear at a National Security Council meeting. And I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for holding this extraordinary event. Good day, everyone.